Welcome to Mrs. Hardison's lesson on graphing with your calculator. Be sure to have your calculator with you so that you can pause the video and try these things on your calculator as we go along. So we're going to start with the y equals button. This is going to give you a list of y equals so that you can enter in equations that you're interested in graphing. Sometimes when you try to graph an equation, you will get an error. And oftentimes what happens is your plots are on. Plots are for graphing discrete points that you've entered. If you get an error, what you have to do is look to see if any of your plots are highlighted. If plot 1 is highlighted, that means that you have data that's being graphed and you can't graph an equation on top of it. So what you have to do is you go up 2 plots and the cursor is blinking on the one that's highlighted. You just hit enter to turn it off and come back to your y equals, and that should work. If at that point you're still getting an error, what you should do is go back to the very first video and reset the memory on your calculator. It means something that you've entered is conflicting with your ability to graph. So I'd like to start out with x plus 2. And you can note once you enter an equation here, this equal sign becomes highlighted. That means that you will be graphing this equation. If you don't want to graph this equation, say you've entered a second equation, you can turn this off by hitting enter, and that will turn your equation off. Another thing at this point that you can note is you can change how your line is depicted. You can turn it into circles, you can turn it into X's, and it'll graph your line any way you choose by simply hitting enter. And you can change, on this one you can change its color. Not all of you have color ones. If you don't, you can always go to line and it will allow you to graph different lines. This is an interesting feature. When we go back to do our inequalities chapter, this means greater than, and it'll highlight everything that's greater than the line that you are graphing. If you go one more, it will graph everything that's less than the line that you're graphing, or you can simply change the shape of the dots that are used to depict your line. I'm going to return this back to what it was originally and click OK. So to graph this line, you want to highlight the equal sign and hit the graph button. You can see that since our linear equation is so close to the origin, the screen fit is perfect. But if it were not, you could always hit zoom, and I want to show you some of these features. You can do a zoom box where you select an area and it will zoom into that area that you select. Zoom in, zoom out, self-explanatory. Number 6 is one of my favorite go-tos. It is zoom standard, and that'll give you a standard size window of negative 10x to 10x and negative 10y to 10y. And last of all, a very interesting one is zoom fit. Now this doesn't always work. Your calculator will try to guess the point of interest that you would like to see, and if you hit zoom fit, it will zoom in on that area. Let's see what it does here. If we do zoom fit, it shifts our graph down to and makes this y-axis point the center. So in this case, it did a nice job of centering our line. What happens if we try to enter an equation that's not close to the origin? For example, we did a problem on mountain climbing, and the elevation started out at 11,000 feet. So if we recall that equation, it was 92x plus 1,127 feet. If we want to graph both of these at the same time, you leave them both highlighted. If you're doing homework and you just want to see one of them highlighted, but you want to save the rest of them to show me, you can simply turn off this equal sign and it will keep it in your spot but not graph it. So to turn off that graph, you just take your cursor up to that equal sign and hit enter, and that should deactivate that graph. And you can see that here the graph is highlighted and this graph is not. When you go to the graph, you can see that none of our points are near the center of this graph. What we have to do is go to zoom, and I like to use, remember if you scroll down, 0 is zoom fit, and the calculator will try to give you the best fit for the data. And when you hit enter, it gives you this image. Now, I don't like this as much because you can't see the x-intercept very clearly. So at this point, you can go back to zoom and simply click number 3 for zoom out. And it'll say, where do you want the center of your graph to zoom out from? And I just like it in the very middle. And it zooms out so that you can see the y and the x-intercepts. If it's too zoomed out for you, we can zoom back in. And then manually determine our window by clicking the window button. The window button allows you to set what you want your x-min and x-max to be, as well as your y-min and y-max. So I'm going to change our x-minimum from -10 to -20. Remember, this is the correct negative sign. If you try to use the minus sign, it will give you an error and not graph it. And then our x maximum, I'm going to change to 20. The scale means that it's still going on increments of 1. And the y minimum, I'm just going to make that a little larger to make sure that we can properly center our graph on the screen. So I'm just going to make y -20 and see what happens. You don't always guess these right at the first time. Sometimes you have to try it a few times to get it just right. And you can use this in conjunction with the zoom buttons to get the perfect view that you're looking for. So if you hit graph at this point, you can see that I have zoomed out far enough that I can see my x-intercept as well as my y-intercept. So this section also talks about graphing lots of things that are not linear. And is our calculator powerful enough to do that? Of course. I'm going to turn this equation off, and we can try some fun stuff like, what does x squared look like? I'm going to hit X, and then there's a quick square button. And if you hit graph, it will show you the graph of x squared. But remember, we are super zoomed out. So what I'm going to do at this point is go to the zoom and take it back to standard, which is 6. And you can see the shape of our graph is a parabola. If you go back to y equals, the next logical question is, if x squared looks like that, what does x cubed look like? And so I'm going to hit X, use the caret and the 3 to get cubed. And if you graph it, you get a graph that looks like this. And you can see that I didn't turn off x squared, and so they're graphed right on top of the other. Another fun graph to do is absolute value. Absolute value can be found under the math button. This is where we found our nth roots previously, but there's several different menus up here. We want to go to the number menu, so we're going to click left to the number menu, and number 1 is absolute value. So if you select 1, it will give you your absolute value bars, and you can put anything inside. We're just going to do something simple like X on the inside, and then we can cursor over. And that gives us y equals the absolute value of x. And when we graph it, we can see that in green. I hope you've been following along on your calculator. If you have any questions or your calculator is not behaving, and we will fine-tune it in class. Thank you so much, and I will see you tomorrow.